The first time the boys pushed him, the wind smelled like rain and dust. It was the kind of afternoon the village remembered for weeks, the sky low and heavy, the schoolyard hard with packed earth, and the cicadas singing themselves hoarse. Tunde was 12 then, skinny in his school shirt, shoes with soles thinning to promise. He had an armful of books clutched to his chest, and a blue pen stuck behind his ear like a soldier's feather. He did not run when they shoved him. He did not cry aloud. He only felt, for the first time in a fresh way, how small his body could seem in a world built by larger hands. Watch it, little runt, called Sola, the one who liked shouting most of all. The push that toppled Tunde sent a couple of his books tumbling into the dirt. A boy laughed, another jeered. A girl squealed, not in pity, but in the kind of surprised amusement that makes cruelty feel like sport. Tunde gathered his books and bent to write the pages that had rubbed the dirt. He saw his reflection in a puddle, and for a second he could not place the face looking back. The face was the one that learned to make itself small. The face that learned to measure everything by how much it could avoid drawing attention. He learned to duck under words and sidestep glares. He learned to keep his head down between the walls of the classroom and the dim alleyways of the village. He learned the geometry of avoidance until it fit him like a second skin. But the mind is an unquiet thing. Even while Tunde practiced being invisible, he was learning other shapes. At night, when stars pricked the roof and the village quieted to a distant hum, he would sit under the eaves and open his books again. Where the school taught numbers and languages, the books taught him larger horizons. They carried names of countries he had not seen, inventions he had not touched, ideas that made his chest ache with a strange hunger. He read of engineers who built bridges over rivers that seemed endless, of poets who turned their loneliness into light, of inventors who turned old things into new. Among those pages, Tunde met a quiet, stubborn voice that would not let him go, a voice that said, in small letters, "You will be more than what they tell you." Sometimes, when the village was asleep and the moon leaned low, he would practice standing in the courtyard, not with his body alone, but with what felt like lifting the weight of his own shoulders. He would plant his feet, unclench his hands, breathe, and then hold. For a few stolen seconds, he would imagine himself not small, but steady. The other boys noticed him in odd ways. If a classroom roll call asked for names, their eyes slid over him as if expecting his silence. If a ball flew past, someone would trip him to watch him tumble through slow motion. The cruelty was rarely violent enough for the teachers to make a spectacle. It was gentle, efficient, the kind that made a life shrink without anyone declaring war. And then there was Ada. Ada sat in the shade of the mango tree and drew birds most afternoons, her pencil making soft, certain strokes in a small notebook. She was the sort of girl who did not need loud clothes or louder laughter to notice the world. She noticed shapes. She noticed the way a cloud folded into a mountain, the way a smile could be senses and shelter both. When she noticed Tunde, she noticed not because of pity, but because she needed to understand how people stood when the wind bent them. At first, he did not notice her the way he noticed Sola's sneers. Ada was a background kindness, the kind that arrives without announcing itself. She would hand him a fresh page when his papers were dirty. She would leave a pencil on his desk when he sapped. She did not say, "You poor thing," and she never folded him into definitions. She simply fixed what was broken and walked on. Their friendship unfolded like a cautious map. Ada's family had a small store near the market where she sometimes helped wrap yams and fold greens while her mother's hands moved as quick as prayers. Tunde started buying a small sweet now and again, not for the sugar, but for the moment of exchange with Ada. They would sit under the mango tree, share a thin sunflower cake, and talk about small things, the color of the next sunrise, the smell of a new book. When Tunde spoke of the things he read, his voice would change. It would find a notch that made sense to himself. Stories shaped them both. Ada loved tales of people who left and came back with better stories. Tunde loved puzzles and blueprints, the logic of how something that did not exist could be designed into being. They traded stories like secret coins. The bullying never fully stopped, but it softened when Ada was near. There is a kind of mercy that arrives in the presence of witness. To be seen not as a project, but as an equal is a small, subtle reformation. Tunde learned to laugh a little when Ada laughed. He learned to answer when called. He learned slowly that some parts of himself could stand up even if other parts still wanted to hold tight to the safe shape of smallness. Time, like tide, moves without ceremony. Seasons pressed on. Tunde grew into 16 with elbows and awkwardness that found their own gravity. Ada grew with a steadiness that suggested she carried an inner scale, always deliberate. always kind. By the time they reached the new school year, the village had a rumor, a scholarship opening in the city, an internship with a small but serious engineering firm that came once every season to recruit young people with promise. That rumor clung to Tunde like a lantern. The firm would accept one boy from their district. It would mean leaving for the city. It would mean everything he had tasted in secret. The steel and glass of things that could be bent to purpose might be within reach. But the application required two things: a recommendation and, for the lucky, a demonstration of a practical project. Tunde had little money and fewer contacts, but he had reckoning in notebooks full of designs. On the day applications opened, he walked to the market with his notebook hugged to his chest, hands trembling with a careful hope. He wanted to show them a crude model he had built from bent wire and bits of scavenged tin, a simple mechanism that could lift water an inch higher into a bucket, a small thing, but a promise of leverage. When he arrived at the intake center, the boys who once shoved him sauntered in wearing new shirts and loud shoes. He felt the old mouth ache in his chest. He could have swallowed his hope and backed away, but he held the model out and spoke steady. He explained how the gears worked, where the leverage came from, why a little better force could mean a better well in a dry season. The examiner looked first at the model, then at the hands that held it. "Who recommended you?" she asked. "Mr. Bassi, the teacher," Tunde answered. "Very well," she said. "You'll present next week. The week between hope and fear is a long one." Tunde walked his days in a state of careful rehearsal. Ada helped him refine his explanation. She sat with him while he practiced, turning the wire model gently in her hands, asking questions that made him speak clearer. He could feel her watching him as one watches a small bird learning to fly. On the day of the presentation, he was nervous, yes, but he was also lit in a way that the months of silence had not allowed. He stood before the panel of men who smelled like strong coffee and held authority, and he explained his design. He did not plead for warmth or for pity. He showed, cleanly, how intention and small ingenuity could change the geometry of a well. When the head of the firm stood to speak, Tunde felt the old dread, the old fear that he had given them nothing worth noticing. But the man simply smiled, and then he turned to the examiner. "This one," he said, pointing at Tunde, "has something that matters." A scholarship followed. An invitation to travel to the city came with it. His heart felt like a kettle about to whistle. Ada hugged him in the shadow of the mango tree, but she did not make promises she did not mean to keep. "Go," she said, and the word was both blessing and bartering. She did not say stay, because she would not try to hold a river. The city was more than Tunde had imagined. It was loud in a new language of opportunity. Buses with glass that seemed to swallow the horizon, people with briefcases who moved like currents, buildings that reached up as if to poke holes in the sky. He boarded the program with a hunger and a humility that made him both awkward and respectable. He had merit, but he also had to learn the rights of a different place, how to speak corporate English that slid without rough edges, how to manage money, how to keep a small apartment with water from the tap that did not complain. Time in the city taught him tools and temper. He learned new engineering practices, made projects that began to look more like machines that could change lives, not only fix a bucket. He studied late. He worked in an internship for that firm and found the grating, polite air of industry both intimidating and intoxicating. The boys who had bullied him in school remained shadows of a small world. Their echoes reached him only in the shape of a memory. But memory is a long room. You carry it into new houses until it becomes part of the furniture. There were nights when he called Ada because the ache of homesickness wanted a map. She would tell him village things: rain on the parched patches, the market selling the red yams that had the taste of a good year, the gossip about who had wed whom. Her voice fit his memories like a warm thumb. She was there in a small line on his world, not a constant physical presence, but steady as the tide. Years braided themselves together. Tunde worked with focus. He saved money. He declined enticements that would carry him far from his purpose. He built a startup that designed affordable pumps for rural wells, devices meant to lessen the work women carried on their heads for miles. The project took him through sleepless nights and small victories. The first prototype that did not sputter. The first village that agreed to a pilot. The first child who could pour water into a basin without tugging at a rope. When his product began to gain attention, investors followed. He learned to speak their language. Presentations, forecasts, metrics. He learned to take the credit that once felt like a view of someone else's life. His company grew, and with it the life he had sketched in his notebooks. There were parties, yes, and people who admired his story of a village boy who had built a better pump. But there were also empty windows and a sense that success, like any good story, was more complicated than applause. One morning, he received a message that made his chest tighten. His father had fallen sick. The words came across like a sudden cloud. He bought the earliest ticket and returned to the village with a head full of reports and patents, with a body that had adapted to a city bed and a heart that had to learn how to reinterpret the weight of a small home. The village was the same and not the same. The old tree still stood, though it had grown a little more wrinkled. The market still bustled. His father's bed smelled of herbal steam and mustard leaves, and Tunde sat at the edge of the cot and felt the pull of a life that could not be ignored. He stayed for longer than he had planned. He checked on the pump installations, watched as children grabbed water more easily, and listened to elders who said his name with an odd reverence, as if he'd done something they had always expected, but never thought to ask for. Zainab lived 3 streets away now, married some seasons back to a man that was steady and good. She had 2 children who ran around with the reckless ease of small people. When she heard that he was home, she sent him a small paper, a simple invitation to come to the market for bread when they met. Time angled differently. They were no longer 20 with a mango tree between them. They were men and women folded into other lives and other responsibilities. Zainab's laugh was still a warm measurement, and Tunde felt an ache that was not regret exactly, but something heavy like rain before broad daylight. They walked and spoke of many things. She told him about motherhood, about the small rhythms that had taught her endurance. He talked about the pumps and the lists of places had implemented them, about how people could now carry extra water to sell at the market, and how schools had a little more clean water for their hands now. He noticed, as always, how her eyes listened. He wanted to tell her everything he had become. He wanted her to see how the boy who had once had nothing had now created something useful. He wanted, too, for the story in his chest, the story that had learned to stand to be read aloud and understood. There was a moment when the children ran ahead on the dusty path, when Zainab's hand brushed his as they moved, and the old ache opened wide enough to let grief out. But her hand was not the hand for leaving. Her hand belonged to the life she had chosen, a life that included small dinners with her husband, a small house, a garden that grew okra like an easy prayer. Tunde left that afternoon with a head full of impressions and a pocket full of old promises that had grown thin. He thought, with the naive hope of his youth, that perhaps he might fit into the folds of her life. But children require attention that cannot be borrowed. Marriages gather their own gravities. He understood, with a steady, quiet pain, that his triumph measured in other currencies did not uproot what she had built while he was gone. He spent that evening under the old tree where boys once shoved him, and where he had learned to practice standing. The moon rose, the same moon that had watched him as a boy. He thought about his choices when he had left as a young man. He had believed that sacrifices would be clean. If he gave up love for progress, then progress would arrive clean as proof. But life was not a ledger. Costs are not always recoverable. There are losses that come with learning, and sometimes a win cannot be spent at the places that count. There is a kind of sorrow that is not shapeable into complaint. Tunde sat with that sorrow the way an elder might sit with the ache of an old bone. He held it in his chest and let it breathe. It was not the woeful kind of bitterness. It was quiet. It was honest. In the months that followed, he returned to the city with a gratefulness for the work he had done, but with a new, humbler knowledge. Success cannot mend some of the things that matter. He began to invest his money differently. He poured resources into community centers that offered mentorship to boys like he once was. He sponsored one young apprentice after another, not because he wanted to make them into him, but because he had seen how a single person's kindness, like Ada's or Zainab's, could change the trajectory of a life. He learned the posture of giving without expectation. He supported the school that had once ignored him. He created scholarships so that other boys might not need to choose between love and ambition, and so that young girls might be supported in their own education. And sometimes, on the rare evenings when he returned to the village for a respite from meetings and forecasts, he would stand under the old tree and watch Zainab play with her children. He would not approach. He would not ask for anything. He would simply look and remember what he had been and what he had lost. In that watching, he found a humbling kind of gratitude that the world made room for different people to be brave in different ways. Years later, when people in the village told the story of the boy who left, they would tell it with both praise and a kind of caution. Be careful, they would say to the boys in the shade, for ambition is a strong wind. It can lift you, but it can also swerve you from the path you once loved. They did not say it to shame, but to mark the complexity of being human. Tunde did not marry again for a long time. He traveled much, and his projects carried him across the country and beyond. He built things that mattered: systems of water, small schools that were run on community trust, a foundation that sought to make easier the path from imagination to invention for those born with less. He taught apprentices the prosaic mechanics of gears, and he taught them the harder lesson that a life measured in dollars was only one accounting of success on a cool afternoon. When he was older and his face had the gentle lines of someone who had loved and mislearned and grown, he received a letter. Zainab had written. Her husband had passed the previous winter. She wrote in a hand steady as a tree's ring. She wrote to say that she had been thinking lately of the boy who had once wanted to be more than small. She wrote to say that there were stories she wanted to tell him about the children, and there were days she would like to sit again beneath the mango tree and speak of how the world had folded them. The letter arrived like an unbidden gift. Like a mirror held up, it did not erase the past, but it offered new ground for honest talk. They met that afternoon in the market, where the air tasted of roasted peanuts and the sky leaned with summer heat. They did not speak of debts or of forgiveness as accounts to be tallied. They spoke of their aging parents, of the ways children change people, of the small, steady work of keeping a heart from closing. Time had taught them both. Zainab's hair had silver threads in it now, and she laughed easily. Tunde felt lighter in ways he had not measured before. They shared a small plate of roasted plantain and sat in a corner where the market music could not pry their attention away. They did not unmake the years. They did not pretend a different past, but they found, like two withered boats meeting in a calm harbor, that conversation could be a kind of repair, not of what had been lost, but of what one could still make of the days ahead. In that quiet, Tunde understood something essential. He had once believed that to win meant to overcome, to gather more than you had been given. He had thought success would be the final story at which every other plot pointed. He had been wrong in the way youth believes truth can be learned like a fact. Winning, he came to see, had other shapes. Sometimes winning meant making a machine that lifted water and reduced a mother's labor. Sometimes winning meant supporting a child to learn to read. Sometimes, and perhaps hardest of all, winning meant learning to be present to what remained, to offer kindness even when it does not repay you, to steward your gifts in ways that benefit others, and to accept that some doors, once closed, are never reopened. And on nights when the moon emptied the courtyard into soft silver, Tunde would walk to the old tree, now ringed with grass taller than before, and sit. He would think of the boys who had once pushed him, and of the way he had once bent. He would remember Ada's small kindnesses. He would remember Zainab's patient listening. He would think of the cost of choices and the currency of second chances. He had lost one great love, and the losing changed him. It did not make him bitter. It made him careful. In the end, his life was not a single story about victory or defeat. It was many stories braided together. It was an ordinary, complicated human life in which a boy who had been bullied learned to stand, and then learned how to stand for others. That is the kind of life that holds resonance. It is not made of triumphant endings, nor of simple moralizing. It is made of decisions, of frequent small acts that either save or surrender who we want to be. It is made of the life after the choice, the slow, sometimes painful work of living honestly and in a village, under the mango tree and beneath the watchful sky. Some people say that the most important thing was not that he became rich or famous, but that he returned with hands that would now lift others. They will tell you too, that the heart is not only to be won, but to be tended. So if, when you listen to this story late at night, you find yourself thinking about the moments when you stood still and let a breeze pass you by, remember Tunde. Remember that a life measured in victories and losses can still be reshaped by the simple moral of presence, that our greatness is measured not only by what we achieve, but by what we give away. And remember, above all, that some loves are not only about possession, they are about being witnessed. They are about two people giving space for one another to grow. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to turn and help someone else to stand. You have been listening to The Story Hut.